Hello, and you're a kite dancing in a hurricane, Mr. Bond. Welcome to Best of the Rest, the show where we take a second look at movies that were poorly received upon release and challenge ourselves to only talk about the things we like and what the movie does well. It's 007 month, and this week we are talking the 2015 film Spectre. My name is Chris Logan, and I am joined, as always, by kind of my brother, but not really, Andrew Williams. Are you ready for this one, Andrew?
I am. Thank you, Chris. That's very flattering. But yeah, I have not dived into this one in some time. I've been meaning to ever since No Time to Die came out, but life being what it is, I naturally never have. So I was excited to get back into this one and see if my thoughts had changed. Wasn't the biggest fan when it came out, but I was eager to see what time had done for me.
Yeah, unlike every other movie we've covered this month, this is a movie that I have seen before. As I've said, it's my last week I get to say this. I had never dove into the classic James Bond movies. I came on board with Daniel Craig, and not even with Casino Royale. The first 007 movie I saw, beginning to end, was Skyfall, which I saw in theaters. It was just getting these insane reviews, and I wanted to check it out, and I didn't quite understand everything because a lot of references to the movies that came before it, but I was totally on board. My biggest takeaway at the time was, wow, James Bond is Batman. There's a lot of parallels. We'll talk about them later. But I saw that one and I was intrigued. I went back and I watched Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace at the time. And then I saw Spectre in theaters. And like you, it wasn't my favorite of the series. I might have been a little higher on it than you were because there's a lot of like legacy stuff. Longtime Bond fans have some problems with this movie that I, of course, didn't have those attachments. But it definitely felt like a kind of a weak way for this series to end, which was how this movie was presented and was quite a very real possibility at the time. This was going to be the last of the Daniel Craig movies. As far as the last time I watched it, before I saw No Time to Die, I watched the entire series again. I bought them all on 4K, and I watched all the movies again. So I've seen this one a couple times, and rewatching it now for this podcast, I got to say I've enjoyed it more than ever. We've talked about these movies a bit already off mic, but I think this movie has only benefited with time and the fact that it is not the final film and more comes after it. It kind of retroactively helps smooth over a lot of issues that people had. But when it was released, which was kind of the premise of our show here, poorly received movies, upon release, I think that's pretty safe to say it was the poorest received of the Daniel Craig movies. It's really a toss-up between this and Quantum of Solace, which is the other one some people kind of have some problems with. But in my opinion, the complaints about Quantum of Solace, to boil them down, are always like, it's a little bit boring. And the complaints about Spectre are like, this is a weak weight in the franchise. It's a much more stronger of a, quote-unquote backlash to this one. So I think it's a little bit more appropriate for our Daniel Craig entry this month.
I think so too, and just the kind of the specter of it all was kind of hanging over this too. It's because this was the first film to feature Spectre and seemingly Blofeld in decades. Like the rights issues over the Thunderball book, which is what aptly titled Spectre and gave Blofeld a name, were finally resolved. And so this movie ended up not really inadvertently, but ended up with a lot more of a microscope just because it was finally bringing these kind of hallmarks of the franchise back for the first time in so long. The joke of Quantum of Solace is that everyone's like, well, Quantum was clearly just a stand-in for Spectre, which this movie then promptly just reveals is absolutely the truth. That's all it ever was. But it's so I think this one had a lot more hype, and I think that impacted it for better or worse, to have to address, and kind of people were like, not just is it bringing these things back, it's kind of underwhelming. I think there were some plot developments that people really thought were a little much, and overall I think like you said, people just were kind of underwhelmed. They, we'll talk about the director and the writing and all that later. And, so I don't really think you can fault any of that. But a lot of people, I think, just really pointed to that script and were just kind of like, this isn't quite juggling all the things that it's trying to do.
Before we fully dive into it, I just want to throw a spoiler warning out there. I mean, of course, we're going to spoil Spectre. You should know that already. But inevitably, there's a good chance we're going to throw some spoilers out there for No Time to Die as well, just kind of as we talk about the entire Daniel Craig saga. So if you have not seen that film and you're sensitive to those spoilers, just be aware. If you didn't know that James Bond leaves MI6 to join Monarch, revealing that the 007 franchise is in the same universe as the Godzilla and Kong franchise, if you weren't aware of that, don't listen to this podcast yet. Go watch the movie first. Preserve those surprises.
Yeah, exactly.
But for now, it's all about Spectre, the movie that was released November 6th of 2015, made on a budget as high as $300 million. There's a few estimates that were given out there, but it is literally one of the most expensive movies ever made, especially at that time. We've had a few come in over it since then, but one of the most expensive movies of all time. And at the box office, it brings in $880 million. So even with that giant budget, it still turns a profit. Critically, a little more middle of the road, like we were saying earlier. It holds just a 63% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes. Perhaps more telling, only a 61% audience score. So really, there was a bit of a backlash this movie, especially from long-term James Bond fans, and they made their voices heard. So a mixed reception, mixed to positive is probably the best way to summarize this movie's reception.
I think, I think that's accurate. There was definitely things people still liked. Absolutely. It's, you've got the direction, you've got the set pieces, you still got some really great performances, but it is, it's a little bit middle of the road. Ironically, I don't think any of the Daniel Craig movies are technically rotten. I think they all breach that 60% threshold, but Quantum and Spectre are the ones that are kind of sitting right at that line. I think Quantum's only at 64. And so it's definitely seen as a weaker installment. And I think middle of the road is a good way to put it.
Sean Connery, Timothy Dalton, Daniel Craig, no rotten entries. Pretty solid. Elite class there.
Yeah, it's interesting that the only real instances where you get that is Brosnan, who actually has 3 rotten and only 1 fresh, and then Roger Moore, who has he's another one that's pretty middle of the road. I think he's got 2 that are above 70, and then the rest are all 60 or below. So it's an interesting way to look at it, because Spectre was widely seen by a lot of people as kind of this weak entry to the James Bond franchise, but a middling James Bond movie is still apparently better than a lot of other things.
Let's take a look at the creative team. The movie is written by John Logan. Nice name you got there, sir. I think of Logan as a last name, Andrew, for obvious reasons. It's my last name. When you hear the word Logan, the name Logan, Andrew, do you think first name or last name?
I think last name. Wolverine's not a real person.
A lot of people mix my name up and which one's the first name or last name, where they hear Logan, they assume that's my first name. But I'm firmly in the last name camp. But anyway, this gentleman, John Logan, a longtime writer in Hollywood, lots of high-profile stuff to his name. Before this movie, really cut his teeth, broke in with movies like Any Given Sunday, Gladiator, The Last Samurai. I mean, his scripts are getting directed by very high-profile directors. The Aviator, Sweeney Todd, this little animated movie called Rango. Andrew, have you seen Rango?
I have.
It's really good. I really like that movie.
It's very good.
And he also wrote Skyfall, so they brought him back to work on this one as well.
I mean, like a who's who. You can't leave out his debut theatrical film, though. Bats. The
I
great,
used to,
fantastic horror film.
this is really dumb. A little joke in my family between me and my older brother and my dad was, why do they call this movie that's about bats Stab? Because like on the poster, they flipped the title upside down.
Because, bats hang upside down, kids.
It's Lou Diamond Phillips in that, right?
Yeah, I think so. I have not watched folks. I have not watched Bats in a very long time. And some interesting genre stuff here too. He was a co-writer on Star Trek Nemesis with Rick Berman and actually Brent Spiner, who plays Data on Star Trek. And a lot of stuff, like you said, a who's who of films. Gore Verbinski, Tim Burton, Martin Scorsese, Ridley Scott, Oliver Stone. Had actually even written a film that Ralph Fiennes directed, who we'll be coming back to later.
I like how you're always so deliberate with your pronunciation of his name. Are you worried you're going to get it wrong, or you just Ralph Fiennes?
And then even recently jumped into the director's chair for the first time. John Logan, that is, to direct They/Them, a slasher film that's up on Peacock, starring the greatest actor of all time, Kevin Bacon. Returning to a summer camp. And he was also like creator and executive producer on Penny Dreadful, which was a fun little kind of horror-tinged version of League of Extraordinary Gentlemen type situation. A bunch of public domain characters kind of all sitting around. And actually, one last thing that John Logan wrote that I want to shout out is a movie called RKO 281. This is actually I think it was made for HBO, but it is a film about the making of Citizen Kane, which is, I actually like it a lot. Stars also the greatest actor of all time, Liv Schreiber, as Orson Welles, which is possibly the greatest casting of all time. And it's stacked. John Malkovich, Roy Scheider, James Cromwell, David Suchet, Fiona Shaw, Melanie Griffith. It's a huge, great cast. I don't know where you can really find this. I just remember watching it. It was like a special feature on like a Citizen Kane Blu-ray I bought years ago. I don't know if it's on the Criterion or not, but
I gotta find it because Liv Schreiber as Orson Welles, I can see it. I can see if Liv shaves, he's got the jowls of Orson Welles. I can picture that perfectly.
That's because that's the most important part. It's the same thing with playing Nixon. If you gotta have the jowls. If you don't, you're just wasting our time. But
the only time I ever hear the word jowls is in relation to those two men.
Yeah, exactly. There's no other people. But yeah, John Logan, like I said, he's no stranger to this. Like I said, he was another kind of repeat writer, which the Bond franchise is no stranger to, but also coming back again, working alongside Sam Mendes.
Yeah, and a lot of John Logan scripts are primarily or solely written by him, but this is a Bond movie. It's going to be a collaborative effort. So we have Neil Purvis and Robert Wade contributing as well. We talked about them last week. They've been on the Eon Productions Bond writing team for quite a while at this point and are still involved to this day, as recently as No Time to Die. And then we also have a credit on this script by Jez Butterworth. Now, Jez is really known for being a script doctor. A lot of his credits are in collaborative efforts punching up scripts. You'll see his name on movies like Edge of Tomorrow and the excellent Ford v. Ferrari.
Ford v. Ferrari is fantastic. So he has definitely a couple of credits with James Mangold, because he and his brother, actually, John Henry Butterworth, who you will see on a lot of scripts that John Henry Butterworth has written. Jez jumps in as well. They are co-writing with James Mangold Indiana Jones 5. So
Nice.
No strangers to the big blockbuster franchises, but also,
Do you know who their mom is?
Mrs. Butterworth.
Yeah.
Moving on. But yeah, I do want to also shout out Ford versus Ferrari. That was fantastic. That was an absolute blast at the movies. Great stuff.
As we've said already, the movie is directed by Sam Mendes, returning from Skyfall. Because here's the thing about Skyfall, Andrew. It made over $1 billion at the box office. Highest grossing Bond movie. Even though throughout the series and a lot of the James Bond movies, they really believe in the revolving door of directors, they couldn't get around it. They had to bring this guy back. Some talks with other directors did fall through, so they did make an attempt to make a change, but didn't want to mess with the formula that worked ultimately, and he steps back into the director's chair here. And, even though these James Bond movies have a lot of oversight by the production company, not in a bad way, but there's a lot of quality control, keeping the feel consistent. This movie does feel like an extension of Skyfall in the way it feels and the way it's shot. You feel that presence of a same director from Skyfall into this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the plot is carried over from Skyfall in many ways. We'll talk about it more later, but like the crux of his mission comes from a message that the previous M had left for him. So there's definitely a lot of carryover and a lot of definitely trying to create that feel of kind of almost a continuing story, which really the Bond movies had kind of avoided for a long time. Like there's definitely plot points that carry between movies sometimes, but by and large, there's this standalone feel to James Bond movies. And you can attest to this a little bit, having kind of watched just scattered ones throughout it. Like, rarely are you kind of lost watching a James Bond movie.
Definitely.
One of the only exceptions, really, I think, would be Diamonds Are Forever, where that intro scene where he's got that kind of vendetta against Blofeld that he's trying to enact feels a little connected to the previous film. But
yeah,
and that really, once it's over, it's over.
They wrap it up and then move on with a new plot.
They move on. That's the only instance of it. The Craig movies are really the first instance where you kind of try to get a bit of a building story, and it really kicks into overdrive at Skyfall to Spectre. Like you said, he wasn't the first choice. I think one of the names they mentioned was Nicholas Winding Refn. Is that his name? How you say it? I don't know. Drive, for anybody that's seen that movie or any of his other neon tinged lighting movies. But yeah, ultimately Sam Mendes comes back. Obviously, Sam Mendes, no stranger to acclaim. I mean, his first movie was American Beauty, and then Road to Perdition, Jarhead. Tons of great movies, well received, tons of acclaim.
What's interesting about his filmography leading up to Skyfall is, we've talked about this a lot on the podcast, this era in the early 2000s especially, is still happening today, but where big time franchises would take like a small indie director with a small indie hit and give him the keys to a big budget film. And they kind of do that with Sam Mendes, because he had a hit called Away We Go with John Krasinski, which was very popular like in the festival circuit. And then he got to move on to Skyfall. But before Away We Go, he had, like you mentioned, American Beauty and Jarhead. So he was doing like big budget and Hollywood movies. And then he does an indie hit, and then boom, he comes back
Skyfall.
With Skyfall, the biggest movie there is.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see. But yeah, he crushed it. And the movies he's done since then, I saw 1917. Great. If you're into war movies especially, I think that's a fantastic movie to watch. He's got a new one coming out called Empire of Light, which looks a little bit more like he's getting into that kind of drama place again, kind of moving away from the bombastic action. And we'll see if my nostalgic sentimentality that emerges in the winter season drives me to go see it.
Well, Andrew, I think it's time. Let's jump into this movie, talk about all the best parts, everything we like about the movie Spectre. After the death of M, James Bond received a pre-recorded message from her with a directive to assassinate a terrorist named Marco Sciarro. After following her orders during an unsanctioned mission in Mexico, Bond is suspended from action by M's successor. With secret help from Q and Miss Moneypenny, Bond continues his investigation, and it leads him to the daughter of a former enemy, Madeline Swan. Wishing to know more about the circumstances of her father's work and death, Madeline accompanies 007, and the two eventually come face to face with Ernst Stavro Blofeld, leader of the criminal organization Spectre. Blofeld holds the two captive as he prepares to launch his master plan to take over the world's leading intelligence agencies. Now, James Bond must overcome his captivity and personal demons to bring Blofeld down. Andrew, as always, as we've said all month, very dense movie. Lots of twists and turns, lots of characters, but maybe the most straightforward of the movies we've covered so far. I mean, I left some twists and turns out of that synopsis, but it's very much linear, I think. Like each mission, each lead leads to the next one in a very successive way without bouncing around too much. You've kind of got two plots going with James Bond tracking down Blofeld and then M back at headquarters trying to survive during the hostile takeover.
Yeah, absolutely. It's we mentioned this just before the show, but this is no exception to the runtime rule. This is still a very long film, easily 2.5 hours. But yeah, the plot is much easier to follow. Not that the other ones are difficult to follow, but like you said, a very logical sequence of events. Scene to scene is we get clue here that leads us to here, where we get the clue here that leads us to here. Pretty straightforward.
Because James Bond is the world's greatest detective.
He is, which we'll come back to. But overall, yeah, it's definitely the most straightforward, I think, of all the Bond movies we've covered thus far.
Before we jump into all these scenes, we're going to, of course, talk about the cast, starting with the high point, the best casting and best performance of the film. Every episode, we recognize one person who goes above and beyond the call of duty, that they actually elevate the quality of the entire film with their performance. We recognize that person by giving them the Mark Strong Award. Andrew, kick us off here. Who is getting a Mark Strong Award for Spectre?
I thought about this one because there's a lot of performances here I like, but ultimately I got to go back to the man. It's Daniel Craig, James Bond. Got to be my pick for Mark Strong. He's dedicated. He's invested. He makes you believe. I mean, I texted you while I was watching this. Man, James Bond is cool. Like there's just
so cool.
There's just this endless run throughout these movies, especially the Craig ones, where like everything he does, I'm just like, man, that dude is cool. Like he breaks through a wall in this movie and he does it, looks awesome and cool while doing it. Like I don't know how, but he does. But yeah,
while drunk,
like makes it even cooler, kind of. But yeah, so he's on point in this one, like you said. I know the reception at the time wasn't great, but it's very much like Brosnan in World Is Not Enough for me, or Die Another Day rather, where there's still this investment, there's still this ownership, there's still this kind of guardianship of the character that is clearly evident, and they don't sleep through it, they don't walk through it, they are still invested, they're still doing the work, and they're making it believable every step of the way, and this is no exception. Daniel Craig sells everything that's happening, makes it look as important and epic as it needs to, and I'm into all of it.
I'm agreeing with you 100%. Gotta give it to Daniel Craig, also getting my Mark Strong Award. An alum of the show, actually. We talked about him way back on our Lara Croft Tomb Raider episode.
Ooh.
He's been an attractive man for a long time, it turns out.
But
he's just undeniable as James Bond. A lot of great performances. We're going to talk about all of them. But the movie it's a long movie, and it's centered around this man. He anchors the film, and he is just, in my opinion, a perfect James Bond, my favorite James Bond. He's got charisma, he's got guile, suave, he's got the humor, he's got everything. He looks great in a suit. Daniel Craig, by the way, in a suit much more often than tuxedo, a bit of a change of pace. He's a little bit different fashion sense while still being James Bond.
Absolutely.
But I love it. I love his performance. And it's interesting. I mean, you talk about that every time you see him as James Bond, he seems just so dedicated to the role. Behind the scenes and in interviews, especially throughout like the second half of his tenure as Bond, he kind of gave the impression that he hated being James Bond, or at least making these movies. The physical toll that he puts him through. I know he got injured during, I think, maybe Skyfall or one of these. He had a pretty serious injury, and he seemed reluctant to come back to it every time. And it's funny because they tried to end this series kind of multiple times. You know, definitely this one was an attempt to be a finale. Then they bring him back for one more. And he would give interviews, and he's like, I'll do another one if they make me. If it's in my contract, I have no choice. That's kind of the tone he always had. But when he's on screen, he made
never
it
feel
work,
it.
and you couldn't tell at all if there was any kind of reluctance. In fact, I think it maybe even plays into his character a little bit, where he seems just a little bit ticked off at all times. He kind of has that just under the surface, a little bit of cynicism that works for the character.
Like I said, going back a little bit to kind of what we got with Timothy Dalton a little bit in Living Daylights, that cynicism, that kind of almost bitterness, that kind of just idea that they're kind of over it. They're kind of over being James Bond.
Yeah.
Just because, it's not the movies make it look pretty fun, but you really think about what that guy's going through on a day-to-day basis, and it's like, no, I can definitely understand how you'd kind of be done with all this. And that's kind of why a lot of people, I think, point to Timothy Dalton kind of being a kind of prototype for what we're getting here. Unfortunately, Daniel Craig does not angrily pop any balloons in this movie, which marks it down for sure. I don't think he does that in any of his films. So
real missed opportunity for a callback.
You could have, you want a callback. That's the callback they should have done for Die Another Day. Just have him pop a balloon angrily. But it's unfortunate. Some of this, I won't repeat some of the things he said about being James Bond again. There's definitely some very harsh things that he'd said. So it was always interesting to see him come back. I'm sure the dump truck of money always helped. But like I said, it doesn't show through. He's still 100% James Bond in all capacities at all times. So
yeah, and as far as that reluctance, I mean, it's worked into the story ever since. I mean, Casino Royale is the first, his first outing, his beginning as becoming 007. In the events of that movie, he tries to leave it behind and retire, and sail off to the sunset. And ever since then, that's kind of always been maybe in the back of his mind. I mean, he does the same thing here in this movie. He's even asked point blank by Madeline, why do you do it? Why do you choose this life? And he doesn't say, for the thrill, I love it because I'm good at it. He says, I didn't really have a choice, and I haven't thought about stopping. It's just, it is what it is. The events of my life led me to this. That's why I do what I do. So it's not like a passion. It's just, it is what it is. It's kind of his look at it. And it makes for some interesting layers throughout the movies.
It absolutely does. And like I said, this is something they've played with, definitely, like Never Say Never Again, which is kind of the odd Sean Connery one-off. Definitely plays with that idea that Bond is kind of over it, but also it also plays with the notion that the world is moving on from James Bond too, which is something these movies also definitely start to use. The idea that, this movie definitely plays into the plot, so we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but just the idea that in these times, the idea of a lone man handling things is just so antiquated. And of course, James Bond has to be the one to show that maybe it's not so antiquated. But got it. Can't say enough good things about Daniel Craig as James Bond. He's, for pure enjoyment, I got to say he's probably my favorite. I like a lot of the James Bonds, but he's got this consistency that, kind of established early. Even his weaker entries are still pretty dang entertaining, which you can't quite say for everyone.
Moving on through this excellent cast, we have Léa Seydoux playing Madeleine Swann. At this point in the movies, I've kind of questioned, what is a Bond girl? Is it the good one? Is it the bad one? Is it do he sleep? I don't know. This series in general makes a lot of leaps in a lot of important areas, and I don't think that term really applies to her, but she is the love interest of James Bond. There's no getting around that, and that is a very crucial part that her character plays. But also, she is the daughter of an assassin, and it shows in her intelligence and what she is capable of. Léa is a French actor. A lot of her filmography, especially early on, are foreign films, French films. However, she has made a lot of strides as far as breaking into Hollywood with, of course, this film and the follow-up No Time to Die. Also, movies like Mission Impossible Ghost Protocol. So she is one of the few actors who appears in both franchises. Grand Budapest Hotel, The Lobster, a lot of good stuff here throughout. Very busy person with her film credits.
Absolutely, yeah. Kind of recently, like you said, has kind of done some Wes Anderson stuff. Was in the Grand Budapest Hotel. French Dispatch. Also has a brief part in Inglourious Bastards. She plays one of, if everybody's probably heard about the Christoph Waltz scene in Inglourious Bastards, even if you've not seen the movie, I'm sure you've heard about the scene where he's interrogating kind of the farmer in his home and kind of ultimately reveals that he's hiding a Jewish family under his floorboards. But she plays one of the farmers' families. So not feature a lot, very small part. But I do remember her in that. And then obviously Ghost Protocol, I think, was the big thing I remembered her for before Skyfall. But yeah, she's got an interesting part here because she's not she's not like other Bond girls. But sorry, folks. But she's great in this. She's got an interesting role, sits in an interesting place, gets to bring some interesting layers to the character, becomes a major factor in this franchise for the next two installments, both this one and then also No Time to Die. Becomes a big part of the plot in both. And yeah, she does a great job.
Yeah, I like that she is not just swept off her feet by Bond like we've seen so many previous times. And it feels just a lot more of a mutual connection eventually when they do have feelings for each other. They murder a few people and then their passion leads to them embracing each other in the way that it does in movies. But it all works. It's all working for me. Speaking of Inglourious Bastards, speaking of villains, Christoph Waltz plays Ernst Blofeld. Andrew, it's perfect casting. It's fantastic, right? I mean, it's just he's a great villain in any film, but you're casting your ultimate Bond bad guy. Absolutely, Christoph Waltz. And what I find so interesting about this era of Christoph Waltz's career is that, Inglourious Bastards does so much for his career. He's been working for a long time. He's got credits before that. He's bounced around. But Inglourious Bastards makes him this ultimate bad guy. This bad guy with charisma and intelligence, and you don't root for him, but you like when he's on your screen. He's got such a good quality. And ever since then, everything from Green Hornet to this film, to even roles where he's not a bad guy, like Alita Battle Angel. I love him there. He's, Inglourious Bastards kind of showed the world this quality that he has, and he's had these great casting moments at it, and this big surgence in his career, and he just crushes it every time. I love this casting. I love this performance. There's maybe a world where I would have given him the Mark Strong Award, maybe if there was more screen time, maybe if Daniel Craig just wasn't also so perfect as James Bond. I don't know. But had you given him the Mark Strong Award, or had someone else said that his performance was their favorite in the film, I'm not saying that's a crazy pick, because it's damn good.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. He's he'd been around for a long time, but Inglourious Bastards is definitely the thing that puts him on the map and kind of really that's kind of what sets him up with American audiences. He'd done a few kind of things, he's in a movie called Ordinary Decent Criminal, which is an American movie. He's got a bit part in that, but it's Inglourious Bastards that really kind of is here he is. And Tarantino has he said more, he's basically said that, he makes that movie in a lot of ways. Without him, that movie just doesn't work as well as it does. And I agree. I remember there had been talk that I think Leonardo DiCaprio might have been in talks for that role, but I think the right decision was made ultimately. Because it's tough to say because it became such an iconic performance that
right.
Imagining anyone else doing it, but in another world, maybe it is Leonardo DiCaprio's Inglourious Bastards. Who knows? But and then like you said, and then I liked that Tarantino immediately flipped the script with Django Unchained and made him an ally. He's I'm not going to keep him as villains. He's there's range here. Let's use it. So he does. And I've always been a fan ever since. He's also in The French Dispatch, another of the Wes Anderson series of movies that are very Wes Anderson. I don't know any other words to describe Wes Anderson movies except that they're Wes Anderson movies. There's no other way to describe them.
It's a specific aesthetic in everything. It's
and
Wes
pastels
Anderson.
And everything. But yeah, he's fantastic. And Yeah, it's like you said, the minute they announced that he was in this movie, everybody was kind of like, well, he's clearly got to be Blofeld. Like, why else would you put him here? And that was the thing that they were cagey about at the beginning. They were very much like, well, he's not Blofeld. He plays a ski instructor named Franz Oberhauser. And the movie does dedicate to this for a while, but you know from basically the first time you see him that this dude is the villain. And you're just waiting for the shoe to drop. And it's very much something that when the reveal happens, don't get me wrong, I don't think it falls flat or anything, but the audience knows it's coming. It's not something where it's like, we're shocked that he's Blofeld. Puts him in an interesting camp here too, because by returning to play Blofeld in No Time to Die, he becomes the first person to play Blofeld in 2 movies in a row. Because nobody had done that before. Technically.
That's bizarre. So we've talked about the weird casting of James Bond franchise, but like, it's your big bad, it's your big villain. Pick a guy and run with it.
Well, it's very interesting because in the first 2 appearances, because in From Russia with Love and Thunderball, you only see his hands in the back of his head and you hear his voice. And for those 2 movies, to be fair, it is the same unnamed actor playing the back of his head in his hands and the same guy doing the voice. It's Anthony Dawson as the person and then Eric Pullman as the voice actor. But they're also not directly involved in the plot. They never have any contact with Bond. And then it's You Only Live Twice where we get Donald Pleasant. Jan Werwick. Werwick was actually cast first, but didn't work out. And they just really didn't like how he was doing with the role. And then Donald Pleasance comes in. Now, Donald Pleasance's Blofeld is like the iconic look. That's what Dr. Evil is based off of. That's where all of the hallmarks of him come together with the cat, the spinning chairs. Every Dr. Evil mannerism is basically stolen from You Only Live Twice.
It's Blofeld, but he talks like Lorne Michaels. That's Dr. Evil.
Exactly. And then again, from that moment on, it's never the same guy. So it's Pleasance, then it's Terry Savalas in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Charles Gray in Diamonds Are Forever, as we pointed out. John Hollis and Robert Rietti do again a kind of body voice double in For Your Eyes Only, because by that point the controversy had emerged regarding the ownership, so they weren't able to really even call him Blofeld. And then Never Say Never Again in 1983, which is the Loose Thunderball remake, gets Max von Sydow as Blofeld, which again, can't go really wrong there. It's Max von Sydow.
Yeah,
and then
Judge
we don't
Dredd's dad.
Yeah, exactly. So from basically Diamonds Are Forever is the last Eon-produced official Blofeld appearance until Spectre. That is 44 years. Folks, that's a long time. But again, it kind of speaks interestingly to the fact that he still is seen as this iconic foil for Bond, even though he sits out so much of the franchise. Like, Never Say Never Again is kind of your one lifeline about Blofeld in the mid-'80s, but they never get to do anything else with it. And it's so...
I mean, 3 major James Bond actors don't get to face off against Blofeld.
No. You basically don't have it. Basically, arguably, you only have 2. Like, Connery faces him, and then Craig faces him. So, like, nobody else in the interim really goes against Blofeld. Now, I've mentioned this before. There are very clearly villains introduced in the interim that are clearly meant to be Blofeld analogs. You could even argue that somebody like Christopher Walken in A View to a Kill is kind of really just a Blofeld aside. And a lot of those hallmarks of the villain show up in other villains. And so but it is very interesting that for as iconic a villain as he is, how few appearances he actually has at the end of the day. And arguably, like I said, his most iconic presentation is one movie by an actor who never played him again. It is just so strange to think of the legacy of Blofeld and just how little he actually plays into it. So anyway, the minute they announced Waltz was in this movie, like I said, everybody was like, he's got to be Blofeld. There's no question. And ultimately, he is Blofeld. I don't know why they went so cloak and dagger with it. It doesn't hurt the film knowing that he's Blofeld. In fact, arguably it helps it, as my rewatch kind of showed me. I was like, knowing that it's coming.
Hashtag PP, but it's a weird choice.
It's a weird choice, but knowing that he's Blofeld, I think takes some of the pressure off the film. And it's just one of those things. Star Trek Into Darkness did the same thing with Khan, where you were just like, don't add more pressure to your movie. Like, just let us know who it is. But we all know J.J. Abrams loves his mystery boxes. Hashtag PP. But it's a great performance. He's not in the movie a whole lot, which is pretty par for the course for a lot of Blofeld appearances. He is meant to be the man at the top, operating from the shadows, and Christoph Waltz is no exception, especially with the story this movie chooses to tell.
Those are really our key players. We're going to go through a few of the smaller roles here, but again, for a movie that got this runtime and this depth to it, it keeps it all pretty much on track with our key players here. But gotta give a few shout outs, like Big Dave himself. Dave Bautista plays Mr. Hinks, a assassin in this film, a mostly silent assassin, but the man doesn't need to talk because you look at him, he's built like a what is he built like, Andrew?
He's built like a brick house, Chris.
Very well put. He's a very large man, and he kind of gets I don't know what to call it, our weirdo character that is so prevalent in Bond films. Like, it's either the main villain. Yes, but he's got like the weird gimmick. Like, he's got like these metal thumbnails that he uses to gouge people's eyes out. Like, and he's mostly silent.
Yes.
He's the weirdo of the film. By the end of the film, of course, Blofeld gets his iconic scar, making him the bit of the weirdo. But he's kind of the supervillain through most of the movie. And dude, I love Bautista. I love everything he's in. I like a lot of his work as a wrestler, a lot of his roles here. This is 2015. This is hot off of his big break in Guardians of the Galaxy. But man, this guy has such a fascinating film career because a lot of wrestlers turned actors, they become big time action stars for obvious reasons. It's just how they're built and their personality a lot of the time. And Bautista has a lot of roles just like that, but he takes this craft so seriously and has made it a point to like really work on his range. And he shows up in things like Blade Runner 2049 in a small role. And the fact that he's large, like, really has nothing to do with his performance and how good it is. I mean, the dude is just really good at what he does, and it really has a good range. And even though here he's playing like a strong guy, he's just fat. He's got such a presence that just always works. You can't say enough good things about Big Dave here. So happy for his success in films, and love seeing him here.
I absolutely agree. I think he's fantastic. He's basically a character actor in a lot of ways. Like, where you look at like John Cena and The Rock as kind of looking for these like big budget blockbuster performances. Like, The Rock is The Rock. He's this insane. I don't even really know how to describe. Like, The Rock is a little like Wes Anderson these days. There's very little to describe The Rock outside just calling him The Rock.
Rock. Yeah.
That's what he is. That's what he does. And he's this kind of presence unto himself. And John Cena is kind of very similar. He's looking for the big stuff. He's looking for the big performances because he's John Cena. To be fair, John Cena has some bit parts that are hilarious. Like, what's that one with Tina Fey and Amy Poehler? That is escaping my brain. But he plays like a drug dealer that shows up for like 30 seconds. And he's hilarious.
All the tattoos.
He's absolutely hysterical. It's a brief part.
Peacemaker, obviously, is hilarious.
Peacemaker, obviously great. Obviously, the Suicide Squad. So James Gunn getting that cred with both of these guys. But Bautista I've always liked because he feels a little bit different. Even though he's in stuff like Guardians of the Galaxy, the stuff he kind of seeks out feels a little bit more, I don't know if curated's the word, but it looks like he looks for chances to kind of do something a little bit different versus trying to put himself at the forefront. I've seen him in the forefront of things like Army of the Dead, Zack Snyder's film with the same name. He actually turned down something in the Suicide Squad to be in Army of the Dead, and James Gunn fully endorsed that. But done some.
He turned down Peacemaker.
Fun...
You were a Peacemaker for him. Gave John Cena a big break.
Yeah, and he's done comedies too. Like I really like the movie Stuber with him and Kumail Nanjiani. I love the chemistry they had together in that movie. And he's getting he's got his parts in Dune, and then he's actually got a part in the Knives Out sequel coming out any day now. Although by the time this releases, it may already be out. We'll see. But I could talk about Big Dave for hours. He's fantastic. I do love his part in Blade Runner 2049 and the little prequel film he did. I think it is very understated, but again, his size has nothing to do with it. And I like that because it kind of shows again to the kind of things that he's trying to do. And I'm always happy to see him on my screen.
I looked it up real quick. Sisters is the name of that Tina Fey, Amy Poehler movie that John Cena has a little part in. Real quick, looking at John Cena's filmography, according to this here, you know what his first film credit is, Andrew?
Is it not The Marine?
The Marine is in 2006. Apparently in 2000, he's in a little movie called Ready to Rumble. He's uncredited as a gym patron.
Well, I'm going to have to go analyze the tape. Because I think he was...
an excuse to go back.
I wonder... because I wonder if he was at the power plant in the early 2000s. I don't know. No, maybe not. I don't know. He was probably just on the indie circuit and they grabbed him for it because, just needed
look
extras.
At him, man.
Yeah, look at him. Look at him.
We have Andrew Scott as a character named Max Denby, but a lot of characters just refer to him as C. James Bond calls him C early on. A little coy about why he calls him C, but you can draw some conclusions at various points throughout the film. It's a fun little running bit there. But Andrew Scott, great bad guy. He's the younger up and coming leader in the intelligence agency. He's part of this kind of merger between MI5 and MI6, and he's at the forefront of launching this initiative to combine the forces of intelligence agencies with leading nations across the world, kind of pool the resources and basically monitor and surveillance the entire globe, which is some truly terrifying stuff.
It is.
It's revealed by the end that he's working under the guidance of the organization, Spectre, of course. But Andrew Scott, great at being smarmy and
sniveling,
punchable face. Yes, he does it.
You
so well.
Hate him the minute he shows up. There's absolutely zero question. He is, so he's kind of your other kind of, he's the other one you're just kind of waiting for the shoe to drop on. Like, there's something off about him. That he probably doesn't have the best of intentions, and eventually that proves to be correct. It is, he's basically our villain in plain sight. That's basically using, he basically builds this entire spy network, like, right in front of everyone. And people don't really realize what he's doing. It kind of speaks to a few of the modern trends in society where, this guy's kind of just allowed to do this and nobody really questions it. But Andrew Scott is perfect in this role. I remember him probably primarily on the television show Sherlock with, the guy.
Benedict Cumberbatch?
Yes. There it is. He plays Moriarty on that show. So basically ends up playing Bond's kind of villain. And I remember the early stories with that were really, I thought,
Bond's
well done.
Villain?
Bond's villain. Yeah. Holmes's villain.
Get it together, Andrew.
Jesus.
I would never make these kind of mistakes.
You would never, ever, Chris. I've never heard you make a mistake like that. But anyway, plays Sherlock's nemesis, Moriarty, on that show. I really like how they play with his early appearances, too, where they kind of really push... They really push the idea that Sherlock maybe created Moriarty in his head to give himself a villain, and they lean into that a lot. And so he shows up on that show a lot as that character, as they recur with that story. But He's great. But if you need somebody to play your underhanded, sniveling rival to M, you can't do much better.
Now let's take a look at the James Bond supporting cast, the MI6 crew. Of course, we have the aforementioned Ralph Fiennes returning as Gareth Malloy, who at this point has taken over the role of M, the leader of MI6. Real quick, before we talk about this wonderful performance, according to his Wikipedia, Ralph Fiennes' full name is actually Ralph Nathaniel Twistleton Wycombe Fiennes. Look at this name. It's like, of course, given that how Rafe and Fiennes are pronounced, it could be like Rafe George Smith Fiennes, and it's just spelled all weird. I don't know. This letters and pronunciation don't quite match up on this guy's name, but what a name. What a gentleman.
There is actually a Twistleton Wycombe Fiennes family tree. It's actually like 3 like old legacy families that all got merged together at some point. So like he and all of his siblings, including Joseph Fiennes, who's another actor you may have seen in a few things, they are all like they've got these long, ridiculous names, but they all shorten them basically. But yeah, it is a heck of a family lineage there. But Rafe is great. I'm again, he's somebody else that I'm never sad to see on my screen. People probably remember him, Lord Voldemort in the Harry Potter films. That was probably his most high profile thing. That, you know, if you're pointing to one thing, but the English Patient way back in the day, if anybody remembers that movie that won
Schindler's
tons
List
of awards, Schindler's List, in the old Avengers film from the 90s, which itself is the reboot of the 60s television show, plays one of the leads there. I actually just saw him in The Menu. I think I may have mentioned this last week or the week before, but gotta immediately give a huge shout out to that film. I loved it. I thought it was fantastic. Definitely a dark black comedy type thing. But he is great in it. And I love everything. I loved everything about it. I'm probably going to go watch it again. But again, just a recent performance of his that is fantastic. So the dude is still out there killing it. And this is no exception. I liked bringing him in as M. It's a bit of you could call it a return to kind of the old M's of the day, but I thought he was a good choice to take over the role from Judi Dench. And I like his take on M too, because he gets in on the action a lot of the times. M kind of historically has just kind of been this guy that's in the background. He's Bond's boss, the guy that's like, you can't do that, and then he goes and does it, and he's like, ah. M
is
used
James
to just kind
Bond and M the original angry chief, hothead cop dynamic?
Maybe. I just think immediately of the jokes you see about like Steve Harvey on Family Feud, where he asks a question and somebody says a dirty answer, and he's like, "You can't say that on TV," and then the audience actually said it, and he's like, "Ah!" That's basically M and James Bond. Yeah, so that dynamic. So in this one, we get more of the antagonistic dynamic, which we had with Judi Dench and the James Bonds. That was never something they shied away from, but there's still a respect with the characters, especially in like the climax of this one, where M finds out that Bond was right. He was running down something that's a genuine threat. He definitely jumps back in and is like, all right, we're all on the same side again. We got to figure this out. We got to do it. There's no question at that point. It's not, I don't like your methods. It's, there's a bigger problem and we got to deal with it. And I like that a lot. So again, great performance. I liked that transition from Judi Dench to Ralph Fiennes, and I think this movie does make great use of it.
Yeah, it's great that, you know, even though they're often butting heads, him and James Bond, he clearly sees the value in James Bond and what he does, and he's essentially defending him throughout the movie a little bit more indirectly, but he's got to defend the 00 program, and he has a great speech about a license to kill and what it means, and it's also a license to not kill, and it's not something that you can replace with drones and satellite intelligence. And so he's he's sticking up for him as James Bond is actively doing things he tells him not to do. But of course, they see eye to eye by the end, as they often do. But good, very good stuff. Moving through the rest of the supporting crew, we have Ben Whishaw returning as Q, who is Bond's gadget guy and tech guy in MI6. And I absolutely love this casting. I love this performance. I love this take on Q. I mentioned it in previous episodes that because this was my first James Bond series I watched, the young, nerdy tech guy as the role of Q made a lot of sense to me. And it wasn't until afterwards, watching the old ones, that I realized that they're kind of subverting the older gentleman that played this role, Mr. Llewellyn, and his take on Q. But I really like the flip of the script here. I love how witty he is. I love how he's not intimidated by James Bond. No. He looks out for him. He gets it. I love their dynamic and their back and forth. Ben Whishaw is fantastic. I know him. First thing I saw him in was I'm Not There, which is one of my all-time favorite films. Andrew, have you seen this movie? Have you seen I'm Not There?
That's the Bob Dylan one, right?
Yes.
Yes.
It is my favorite take on a biopic, especially like of a musician, because it's not the typical by the numbers thing. It is about Bob Dylan, but there's no character in the movie named Bob Dylan. Instead, they take various points of time in Bob Dylan's life, and they create different characters for each of them, played by different actors. In some cases, it's not even the same race or same gender. It's a brilliant approach. Now, as someone who's a big Bob Dylan fan, I connect with it a lot. I have no idea what it's like viewing that movie. If you know nothing about Bob Dylan, I don't know how much of it really connects or makes sense to you. But that's all to say, one of my favorite films of all time. He's in it as one of the aspects of Bob Dylan, as the younger, smart-ass Bob Dylan that screwed with the media who gave him interviews and he gave them nonsense answers. And he does a great job chain-smoking throughout his performance and giving nonsense answers. Something very similar to what he does here with his sarcastic sense of humor.
Yes, agreed on all counts. But yeah, Ben Whishaw is great. So Q sits out the first two of the Craig films. He is not in Casino Royale, and he is not in Quantum of Solace. They opted to let the character rest, I think, a little bit after using John Cleese in World Is Not Enough and Die Another Day. And then they go, like you said, in a completely different direction with this film by going with a younger Q. And I like it. I think it's a great performance. Like I said, Whishaw is great. Obviously, tons of credits to his name. No question there. But obviously, Paddington is definitely a thing that I recognize him for recently. Being the voice of Paddington in both of those films, including Paddington 2, which is the greatest film of all time. So yeah, I love the dynamic they have. Like you said, it's a great way to approach it. And again, it's that thing where like, yeah, there's a little bit of back and forth, and there's definitely annoyance, but the respect and everything is still there. This understanding that I'm still on your side, we're working together, we're figuring it out.
And then we have, of course, Miss Moneypenny, who also sat out the first two Daniel Craig Bond entries, but comes on board in Skyfall as the secretary to M, but they're often doing additional work on top of that as well. This go round, she is played by Naomi Harris. Wonderful actor. I first heard about her. Most people probably first saw her in 28 Days Later as one of the leads of that film. Tons of credits to her name. I love her as Miss Moneypenny. I love the dynamic with James Bond. We've talked about it in past episodes, but the traditional Moneypenny Bond dynamic is Miss Moneypenny pines for James Bond, and James Bond does not feel the same way about her. They don't do that here. Again, the series has, in this iteration, really evolved in a lot of ways there. But Andrew, I'll be damned if there's not still some sexual tension whenever they're in the room together. But it goes both ways. It feels like it goes both ways. Like they both acknowledge like this will never happen but what if?
But what if? Yeah.
That's the, you can cut that tension with a knife there, and it's fun. I like that.
With a butter
Again, I like
knife.
that.
It's that.
I like that dynamic there. It's that.
I do too.
It's that tender.
Yeah, it's that sliceable. This isn't no $2 steak here, folks. No, I do like this performance a lot. Like you said, she sits out the first few, comes in for these. She's assisting Bond with this one, similar a little bit to what Moneypenny was doing in the Dalton films, just being somebody who can actually contribute versus just kind of pining over Bond. Like you said, there is tension here, but I like that they kind of go out of their way to show that she's not hung up on Bond. She's moving with her life. She's there. Bond calls her once in the middle of the night, and there's a dude in her bed. Like, this may even be like her partner, and Bond just doesn't know it. Like, just literally like that kind of thing. So, like I said, I like her performance a lot. I like that these films, especially in the latter half, really kind of put that new spin on the classic Bond dynamic, and she is no small part of that.
Andrew, I think that covers all of our key players. There's a few other performances that we can definitely shout out as we move through the scenes, but I think it's time to do just that. Move on to the scenes of the film, specifically the best scenes and our personal favorites. So, Andrew, why don't you go to kick us off here? When is this movie firing on all cylinders? What is your favorite scene in Spectre?
This is going to sound really bad.
It's like a new word.
Spectre.
In the film Spectre. You know what I meant. I don't know why I interrupted. Go ahead.
Inspector is related to Innsmouth. It's an H.P. Lovecraft story. But this is going to sound a little backhanded, but I really love this opening sequence. I genuinely like it. I love a lot of stuff in this movie, but like the iconography and just the set pieces and everything in this introduction are just fantastic to me. Like, I love the setting. We're in Mexico City, the Day of the Dead Festival. There's a parade. You've got the big puppets, or I don't think they're balloons. A chance to pop a balloon that they again missed out on. But it's these giant like floats / puppets that are in this parade. You've got the iconography, the colorful costumes, the face paints, the masks. You've got these great settings. A really good tracking shot starts this film, like a really long, like single pan camera shot where we kind of follow Bond from outside to inside and all the way through. I'm always impressed by that, just because it's, you think of films as like you shoot your lines and cut, but then when you start seeing these things that are just these long tracking shots, you're like, man, that is insane. Just reminds me, I watched this movie recently called Boiling Point, which is it's a cooking film based in a restaurant kitchen. But it's a single shot film. Genuinely. They shot that film 4 times. They meant to shoot it 8 times, but then COVID happened. But just anytime I get a good long tracking shot where we're switching between locations and all of that, it always stands out to me, and I always think it's really cool. This obviously isn't that long, but still moving between different buildings, things like that. It's always impressive to me. But then we kind of transition into the action piece of this. We get whole buildings collapsing and blowing up. It switches into like a big helicopter fight, chase through the parade itself too. And yeah, it's just classic. You always get your big Bond kind of cold opens in a way, where like we get our scene before the intro credits.
Right.
And this is one of my favorites of the whole franchise. Just, we've got a unique setting. We've got just a beautiful location. These big, unique, well orchestrated props that create a unique atmosphere that the rest of the film never goes back to. It's great. I love it. It's fantastic.
Man, it is an awesome pick. I agree. One of my favorite cold opens in the franchise as well. And it's that that first shot that lasts however many minutes, where you go from Bond on the streets in his cool like skeleton tuxedo and mask, and he goes into a hotel room, and then that was actually just a ruse to get to the rooftop, and he walks out the window onto a rooftop, onto several rooftops, all in one continuous shot. And yeah, of course, they use technology and stuff to splice multiple shots together to make it appear to be one, we know. But the idea is that it is one continuous shot. And I do like a good oneer. Whenever it's serving some kind of purpose. And I think here it does. Here, like I said, it's the very first shot of the movie. It brings us into this world, and we get immersed in it, and the slow reveal that the person we're following is James Bond. We all knew, but, the reveal when he takes his mask off and takes off that overcoat to reveal his suit underneath and his classic look and everything. And it just immediately draws us into this mission and into this world, into the reality of it. Total success, total works here. You and I have talked previously about the movie Rope, which uses...
Yes.
It's made to look like one continuous shot. And it works there because that is a masterpiece Alfred Hitchcock suspense film. And there's this panic brewing throughout the movie that these killers are going to be found out. And so having the shot that never cuts away adds to that tension. It has a purpose. A lot of times, one-ers can feel just a little bit flashy, and they don't really have a purpose, and they ultimately take you out of the movie because you're looking for those hidden cuts. Not always successful. Hashtag Positivity Podcast. Not trying to dunk on any movies specifically, but Birdman does come to mind, a movie that didn't work for me like it does for a lot of people, but the whole one-shot thing there just stresses me out and doesn't add anything to the movie for me. But Sam Mendes...
Space one?
Space one.
Gravity? Was it Gravity that was supposed to look like one shot?
I don't believe so. Google tells me that it has an unbroken 17-minute shot. Okay. I haven't seen Gravity since theaters. I did really enjoy that movie. I do need to go back and watch it.
It's Alfonso Cuarón. He's pretty good. Sam
Mendes does go back to the oneer he makes 1917, which again is all one continuous shot. Now, full disclosure, I have not seen 1917, but I do know it's a war movie. So I imagine this continuous shot is immersing us into the realities of war, and you never get a break. There's never a break from the tension. So the oneer helps you put you into the minds of the soldiers. I imagine you've seen the movie. You sang the praises of it earlier this episode. I imagine the oneer is helping you feel the pressures of the battlefield.
It makes it very uncomfortable because you essentially are feeling real time what you would be experiencing in that moment, and it's very effective. Sam Mendes is no slouch when it comes to that sort of thing.
I'll have to check it out. I do believe that is one of those classic movies I own that I've never watched. There's sadly too many of them, but I will get around to it, I'm sure. But Andrew, this is a great pick for best scene. I love this opening. I really can't praise it enough. However, I am going to pick a different scene as my personal favorite of the film. But not because that opening's bad. It's great. But when I think about when I was most invested or on board or having the most fun or excitement, high point for this movie, for me, is going to be, it's about the middle of the movie. It's whenever Bond first meets Madeline at her kind of secluded psychiatry hospital that he meets her at up in the mountains. And he tells her that he's there to protect her. He made a promise to her father. And then Hinks shortly shows up and captures her, and Bond has to retrieve her. And we have this awesome chase that starts with Mr. Hinks and Madeline in a convoy going down the snowy road, and Bond with a small airplane chasing after him. And they're shooting at each other.
So cool.
Mr. Hinks gets the better of him. And then he literally plays chicken with him. He flies directly at him in his airplane. And Mr. Hinks has this very cool, double barrel handgun.
Yeah.
That, again, reminds me of Christoph Waltz gun from the Green Hornet.
Green Arrow.
He also had a
Green Hornet, yeah.
Yeah, double barrel handgun there. But it's blasting little holes in the airplane. Yeah. And I love it because the airplane, it loses its wings, it loses the back tail. It gets chopped up throughout until it's barely, it's basically just a cabin in the wheels. Reminds me a little bit of A View to a Kill in that car chase where he gets the top knocked off and then the back half of the car knocked off and he's driving just the front half of the car. By the end of this chase sequence, Bond is driving just the cabin of a helicopter and he drives it through a barn to come up the other side and take out this convoy. It's so cool. And Mr. Hinks, Big Dave there, goes through the windshield in that car crash. And the final shot is him twitching his hand because he's, again, kind of our almost supernatural villain of the film who's continuously chasing him throughout. But I love it. It's a great action scene. I love I guess I'm kind of highlighting the action scene as my favorite, but even the scene at the psychiatric facility leading up to it, there's a lot of great stuff there where Q actually goes into the field, something that he rarely does, and he gets pursued and he has to lose his tail. And the witty back and forth between James Bond and Madeline, actually he's evaluating him and he's giving these very smart ass answers to her questions about what he does for a living. I think this might be the line where he says that he's in life insurance as far as his answer for what he does. Very funny. But it's great. It's got the wit, it's got the strong writing. It's got can't leave this out. One of my favorite laughs of the movie is the psychiatric hospital security is trying to escort Bond out because Madeline's throwing him out. And once Bond realizes that he's got to jump into action and save her, he takes out one security guard with a punch, and then another one's approaching him, and he just holds his finger up and goes, "No, stay," and then he runs off. Like he's away. A dog. Yeah. No, stay. And it works because Daniel Craig is an intimidating person.
Yeah, James Bond.
Would you say he's the most intimidating James Bond?
Absolutely.
I agree.
I would give a watch to License to Kill, but I think Timothy Dalton's the only guy who even comes closer to like getting down the intimidation of James Bond, because there's the charm of the other ones just kind of overrides everything most of the time.
They're always a little too cool for the situation.
Right. And with Dalton, and I think Craig especially, Dalton kind of starts flirting with it, but Craig is the one where it's really just like, I'm scared of this man. I don't want to cross James Bond because he is going to ruin me.
Another scene I really like that I remember getting played up in the trailers a lot is whenever Bond infiltrates the Spectre meeting.
Yes.
And it's the ultimate bad guy boardroom, right? Everyone's like cast in shadow. He's at the head of this impossibly long table. There's like floors of the building looking down on him. But Christoph Waltz is, he's backlit, so his face is in shadow. Bond has snuck in. He's like 2 floors up, but he knows that he's there. And he says, "Welcome, James." And he turns and looks right at him in the middle of this crowd. And that scene I remember from the trailer. And it works so well to where like James Bond is, he's the spy. He's infiltrated this place. He's on their trail. He's figuring stuff out. And then immediately he is trapped and surrounded by bad guys and assassins and has to escape. It's just it's got the look that I love with these types of villains. We've talked about it all month. Like the James Bond franchise inventing the idea of this big bad movie villain. It's got that boardroom and lighting that you would never see in real life. But it's also got this like subversion where James Bond goes from being in charge to being in hot pursuit and running for his life. Yeah. It's a very good scene.
Yeah, and the chase that follows this is also fantastic. It's Bond on the run with Hinks in his Bautista just looked so large in that tiny car. It just didn't look like he fit at all. But this is a great chase scene. I do want to give a shout out to Monica Bellucci. She plays the widow of Marco Sciarra, who kind of gives Bond the ring and gives him the clue to get him into this meeting. So she's not in the movie very long. She is credited as being the oldest Bond girl, as she was 50 when this movie was shot. But she doesn't really show back up after this scene. She's only really in 2 scenes. Not a whole lot of screen time, but just wanted to give her a little shout out because she kind of sets up this big sequence. And then that, like I said, leads us into a really great car chase with Big Dave and James Bond. And I love how it ends. Bond ejects out of his car. Hinks doesn't see it, but I just love Bond just parachutes down, lands on the ground, cuts off the parachute, walks right past like a street cleaner and is like, "Good evening." And just again, this dude's so cool. Like there's no way you can do that and look cool. And then Daniel Craig does it and looks cool. So, but yeah, that whole reveal sequence, because this is kind of our reveal, because he sees at this point Oberhauser at Sciarra's funeral, and then this meeting is kind of the first time we see his face. And it is kind of a big reveal, and in that regard, it is extremely effective.
Andrew, I've got to imagine that one reason that we didn't see Q for the first couple entries is a big criticism of the films by the end of the Pierce Brosnan era was they were almost too gadgety and gimmicky, and James Bond wasn't using his wits so much as using the right tool at the right time. And so I think there was a conscious effort to dial that back a little bit.
Yeah.
I often see two things credited with the big change going into Casino Royale in the Daniel Craig era, as far as what forced them to make some changes. One is Austin Powers, because here you have this parody of the James Bond films, but by the time you get to Die Another Day, I mean, we talked last week about the amount of puns in that movie.
Yeah.
There's almost no difference between like making fun of James Bond and what actually is James Bond. So that kind of forced them to reevaluate what a James Bond movie is in this day and age. And the other thing that changed things, I think, is Jason Bourne and its approach to an action hero and how it's shot and how it feels and how it's grounded and that shaky cam. And Jason Bourne is real influential, I think, in... I don't have a clever name for it yet, but it's something we've talked about a lot, is this idea of this like action hero, this ultimate badass we've seen all the time where like they can go against 50 people and they're somehow the last one standing. But they also get their ass kicked throughout the movie.
Yes.
Like John Wick is a perfect example of this. Jason Bourne. And then in Casino Royale, he gets literally tortured in that film, right? I mean, he gets his ass handed to him, which has happened off and on throughout Bond, but I think it's really taken to another level there. So, again, all these things add up to Casino Royale being like this new modern action hero while still paying homage. It walks this interesting tightrope and completely nails it from jump, I think. But Q being out and it being kind of light on gadgets, I think was a conscious effort.
I agree.
And then they bring him back in Skyfall and we start seeing more of gadgets, but I still think they find a good balance. I mean, he's got this exploding watch here. He's got his car with all of its tricks and everything, but he's still being a detective. He's still investigating. Right. He's still being a spy. He's still doing his job. And those are just like supplementing what he's doing rather than being the driving force. That's like a fair assessment of how they're using Q and the gadgets here.
I think so. And also I think something that kind of just really, the movies kind of weave it into the plot a little bit, but you've just got changing technology. Like that I think was another big thing, because you had these things that Bond would use that were just becoming very commonplace. Like these gadgets that he has where it's like, oh, well, that's just a thing now. Like, especially with phones and cell phones and things like that. Like the idea of all these things is just, oh, anybody can do that now. So I think it definitely required a recalibration. And like you said, by Skyfall, they kind of try to introduce a new spin on that classic Bond dynamic with M and Moneypenny and The Office and Q and all of it. And everybody's kind of rejigged just a little bit. So like M goes from being just the angry boss into a guy who can kind of hold his own in a fight, and you've seen it and you know it. And so he's not just a bureaucrat. He's a guy who's been in the field and knows what it's like. With Moneypenny, we shift away from the idea that she's just lusting for Bond to the point that she'll put on VR glasses to give herself a weird fantasy. And with Q is no exception. So I think you do get gadgets, but like an exploding watch is like, that's pretty tame in James Bond. In James Bond world, that's pretty normal, honestly. Like a spy has a watch that explodes.
It's even a throwaway thing, because he hands him the watch and Bond's like, does it do anything? And Q says, it tells the time. And then afterwards, he's like, by the way, the alarm is, very explosive or whatever. He tells him that it'll explode, but
watch out for the alarm or something like that. Yeah. But the biggest thing that they can add with Q is the technology. Like the climax of this film is Q hacking into this Nine Eyes system and shutting it down and stopping it from going online. And so that's a ripple that you were able to add to Q. The idea of, I'm in. The I'm in type hacker. But you were able to give that ripple to him and kind of allow that character to expand beyond just being like, all right, here's your jetpack. So I do believe it's deliberate, and I think all of the things you've mentioned are part of it. Because like you said, if you close your eyes through Goldmember and Die Another Day, I don't know if you tell the difference. Like if you're not watching on screen and kind of seeing the visual gags of Austin Powers, you're playing with a lot of like the scene where Austin Powers meets Moxie Cleopatra, is that her name? In Goldmember, versus Bond meeting Halle Berry. I'm like, they're both like cringe-worthy level of puns. Like there's just endless amounts of puns. The scenes are almost no different. Genuinely. And so it's definitely a recalibration, and I definitely think it's deliberate. And like I said, even here, you get a little bit more of the humor is kind of coming back, but like you said, it's very understated. We're kind of, if it's a pun, it's kind of few and far between. It's usually sometimes a little bit more subtle versus the kind of overt puns of Die Another Day. But yeah, I think all of that, and I think the Bourne aspect of it can't be understated either, because I think there's a lot of, especially the cold open of Casino Royale, that's definitely playing in that Bourne identity sandbox of like grounded, kind of street level action with Bond kind of getting his big, Bond taking his fair share of hits. That's a big criticism that you hear from just a lot of franchises. Bond is no exception, but I hear it about Jack Reacher. I've heard it about some of the stuff with Tom Clancy. Like you get these like indestructible protagonists that like, nothing's ever going to happen to them because they're the star of the movie. And Bond's no exception, but it reaches a point of, like you said, almost parody where like, no matter how ridiculous the situation is, there's no tension because you're like, well, they're going to have to get out of it. And so by adding in those notions and those scenes where they aren't really succeeding, a great scene here is his fight with Hinks. Bond does not defeat Hinks. Bond survives Hinks.
Yeah.
Like he does not beat this man in a fight. He successfully outlasts him. And that may sound pedantic, but like he literally just gets Hinks thrown off a train. And that's like by attaching him to some barrels and getting them all out. And it's like, that's skin of his teeth. That's not even a definitive win, like I said. And so I like that aspect of the character. It makes it a little bit easier to get invested because it adds the doubt back in. Just the idea that, well, maybe he's not going to come through this. Maybe this won't work out in his favor. And it usually still does. But in this movie, that's from all of these movies building, I've really liked that aspect of it. And Hinks is, I think, a great kind of distillation of that. Like Hinks is somebody that Bond just cannot beat. And I would not be shocked if he's still alive. Like he falls off the train.
Yeah, you don't see him die.
Reason you don't see him die, you just see him fall off the train. Like for watching it the first time, I was kind of waiting to see if he was going to show back up. He does not. But hey, the future's not written, folks.
In my first of 2 Resident Evil references I will be making this episode, Hinks reminds me of Mr. X from Resident Evil 2, who is an enemy that you cannot kill, but he stalks you through most of the game. You can only slow him down or run away, and that's basically what James Bond is doing throughout here. Yeah. I think another good franchise you can look at for this evolution of the action hero is Mission Impossible, because unlike James Bond, where it kind of gets rebooted and recast and then the new flavor, it's always been Tom Cruise from the beginning. But you compare Tom Cruise in Mission Impossible 2 and Mission Impossible Fallout, and in 2, he's the unfallible, perfect hero who crushes the bad guy and wins. Whereas Fallout, he's like, has 30 broken bones by the end of that movie and just scraping by and gets his ass kicked a lot. And you kind of see that progression throughout the film as just kind of the idea of the action star changes and evolves over time. Yeah,
I think that's another great example. And I'm excited to see that one continue and potentially conclude. And it's interesting because I just remember that I think Mission Impossible 4 was supposed to be introducing all these characters that could potentially inherit the franchise, and then none of them work out. And they all just kept going back to Tom Cruise.
What's funny about that is it's Jeremy Renner that they bring in for number 4 as the clear, like, up-and-comer. He can be the lead of this franchise, and it never happens. It's funny to me because they also bring in Jeremy Renner to the Bourne franchise as the successor, and then it doesn't make enough money, and they bring back Matt Damon into that franchise, too. So Jeremy Renner twice has been like, oh, here's the baton. Psych, we're going to stick with the OG guy.
Well, and it's so weird to me that they went with Jeremy Renner when they had Josh Holloway show up at the beginning of Mission Impossible 4 just to die. that's a different discussion for another day, folks. But um, and yeah, James Bond. Oddly, there's only really that I know of been that one instance where they actually thought about doing a spin-off with somebody else, and it's so weird to think like what would have happened if that had been like some massive success. Like it's like
Dude,
what happens to James Bond?
One of my biggest takeaways after seeing No Time to Die is I would watch a 007 spinoff. The 007 in No Time to Die. Seen the movie? You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
The new 007.
Yeah.
That might. She might be my Mark Strong Award winner for that movie. I'll have to rewatch it. But I love that character, and I would love to see more of her.
Absolutely.
Do you ever think about how cool? Okay, we're getting back to this movie, but when Daniel Craig was first cast, Andrew, there was legit. You could call it a backlash to a blonde man being cast as James Bond, right? People saw him like James Blonde was like an insult. It's a big deal. Like hashtag not my James Bond kind of thing. And by the time Casino Royale came out, it crushed, it silenced most of the critics in that regard. Like this guy is James Bond, but it was a big deal changing the character's hair color. And there's been a lot of talk about like who's the next James Bond gonna be, and Idris Elba's name was thrown out for a long time, which I think is a great choice. But at this point, he's probably aged out of where they want to start with the Bond. But I think that would have been very cool. But people, times are changing. People are thinking outside the box. Like, what qualities does it really mean to be James Bond? I love that in No Time to Die, we get not only a woman as 007, but she's also a person of color. And she's not James Bond. Obviously, James Bond is still there, but without going into all the ins and outs of that movie, like she's full on 007, doing missions as 007.
Yep.
And I think that is a huge success. And while I don't think the next James Bond proper is going to be that extreme of a change, I just hope they find someone interesting.
Yeah, really, at the end of the day, like I realize that there's this trend amongst certain segments of fandom that when they recast characters as POC or change facets of the character's identity, there's this push to say, leave it alone, make your own character. There is this inherent desire to say, leave these things alone, make something new. And on a base level, I mean, I get it to a certain degree, but at the same time, as a lot of these people know, new characters just don't get the attention. They just don't get the visibility. Like, you do a movie like No Time to Die, where James Bond is still a forefront character, but you introduce Lashana Lynch as 007. I think that's a fantastic example of doing the thing in a unique, interesting way and avoiding that pitfall of like, well, James Bond's 007. Why would you do that? It's like, because it's interesting, it gives visibility to a fantastic actress. And at the end of the day, guys, it's not hurting anything. Like, there's tons of stories with your classic James Bond that aren't going anywhere, and they're never going to go anywhere. There's tons of them out there. And so I think it's a balance to be found. But at the same time, I never have an issue with it because, like, I think the way you put it there at the end, I just want it to be interesting and I just want it to be good. And rarely, in an instance of a recast or a change or something, do I ever not like it for that reason. That's rare. Like, if something's not good, there's usually a litany of reasons for that have very little to do with how the character looks. And it's even more simple. Like when Heath Ledger got cast as the Joker, I mean, there was this outcry, and I'm like,
yeah,
guys, they can paint his face and dye his hair. He's gonna look just like him. Like, don't worry. Like, it's gonna be fine. There's this resistance to change, and like I said, in a way, I get it, but at the same time, it's like I've been surprised plenty of times in my life, and I'd like to be surprised more often. Like, I want things to be a little different. I've seen what I like, and I like what I like, but at the same time, like, I have this deeply spiraling thought sometimes where the amount of things that already exist that I would love and don't know about is staggering. It's terrible to think about. All the music out there that I've never heard that I would love, all the books that I've never read, all the movies that I've never seen. And it's like, I don't want to potentially cut myself off from something else that could be in that list. So I want them to take some chances and make some changes to have some fun with it at the end of the day and make it interesting, because interesting is not defined in any one way. So
my first thought whenever I hear the argument, make your own character, despite the problems of even wording it that way, like I said, on a base level, I can understand the first instinct or gut reaction, but what I think of is, make your own character. These characters have been this way for so long. These characters have existed for 60, 70, 80 years, whether it's movie characters, comic book characters, or these pop culture icons. What you're ignoring when you make that argument is that since these pop culture characters have been created, the driving creative force from these studios and companies that create these characters has been very predominantly and by design straight white men.
Yep.
Therefore, They are creating characters that reflect them. And because they're decades old, they become these icons.
They become the status quo.
And so you've deprived the ability for a lot of diversity and variety to become those cultural icons. And so why not have one that looks different or sounds different and represents someone else? It doesn't erase anything, but there's really no downside to it. Right. I also like when new characters are created. I think Miles Morales is an excellent example of this, among many that have happened recently with these types of characters. So, I just want it to be good. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think everyone agrees on that. But diversity matters.
Absolutely.
Period. There's no escaping that.
Absolutely, it matters, and those are all really good points. And I think at the end of the day, diversity matters, representation matters. It's like you said. Well, it's like you meet somebody who's like, well, back in my day, we didn't worry about this kind of thing, and it's like, yeah, because you're a straight white dude. You've never had to worry about it. You've never not seen yourself represented. People that are in their 70s, their 80s, their entire life has been seeing themselves on screen. The experience, it's always been the standard, and they've never not seen themselves there. And so when other people see them, it's a big deal. It's a big deal to see yourself on the screen. When Daredevil finally came to the big screen and there was a blind redhead on my TV, it meant the world to me.
You put your glasses on and you said, "Oh, who's this?
Who's this?" Yeah. And I think James Bond is something that definitely also lends itself to some reinvention, as we've established. And another key thing that a lot of this stuff ignores and a lot of those statements ignore is that these things have changed over time. Like, just because, you look at Superman in 1938, and you look at Superman now, it may as well be two different characters.
Yeah.
It is so wildly different. And not just, maybe he's still a white dude in a blue suit, but like his powers are completely different. His life is completely different. His
He doesn't need to leap over buildings. He can fly now.
But like even James Bond is no exception. You read Dr. No, which is on my shelf back there, and you watch No Time to Die, it could be two different characters. And so when you say things like they've been the same for so long, what you actually typically mean is they've looked the same for so long, because these characters have changed in many ways, almost always. Batman of 39 is not the same as Batman today. And yes, there are hallmarks that exist throughout time. I'm not going to pretend that they don't, but don't also pretend that they've been static the whole time either, because they haven't been. And yeah, they're ever evolving tapestries, and there's no harm in that. It's part of being fictional, arguably, that over time you will change. It's inevitable.
Besides James Bond being blonde, there's some other things I want to talk about, how this Daniel Craig series made some changes to the character. But before I get into that, we got to talk about the finale of this film, right? I mean, the big showdown, we haven't got to that yet. it is, again, it kind of reminds me of that boardroom scene where it is very much movie villain trope, which the Daniel Craig series has been mostly more grounded, but at the end of this movie, they capture him. He wakes up in this abandoned MI6 building that's about to be demolished, and he's got this extravagant, these rooms set up and pictures of his past villains, and it's rigged to blow, and he's got to make a choice, save the woman he loves or escape and live with the guilt. It's very comic booky. It's very, again, classic movie villain, classic Bond villain type. But at this point, 4 movies into this franchise, like I think we've gotten to a point we can pull something like this off. And I do like it. I like the visual of him seeing like the past portraits on the wall and everything. It's seeing M and the people he's faced, the people he's lost, and it's all connected symbolically by these fuses that are going throughout this building that are all tied to Madeline. It's I mean, hashtag PP. You could call it heavy-handed or what have you, but I think it's an appropriate final action set piece for the story being told here of this shadowy figure behind the scenes who's been pulling the strings, and Bond has to face him by facing himself and his own guilt and his own trauma.
I agree. I think that, and also just the way, because the building is being wired to blow anyway, because they're demolishing it in favor of the new building across the river there. And so, but that look of all the wires running through the building, again, we're looking at something that's visually unique, makes it interesting, makes it stand out. And I just thought that was a cool look and a good way to kind of, dare I say, like you said, could be a little bit on the nose, but you can visually see the web that has been weaved around Bond's life at this point. But I think it looked really, really cool. I do like this whole sequence. All of our MI6 people are basically playing parts at this point, including, I want to give a shout out here to Rory Kinnear playing Bill Tanner, the MI6 chief of staff. Now, Bill Tanner is a character that has shown up throughout the years, off and on. It is only in the Craig series that he actually becomes a recurring character, starting in Quantum of Solace, where he is played by Rory Kinnear, and he appears in every film afterwards. The character does appear in GoldenEye and The World's Not Enough, but he does kind of get sidelined in Tomorrow Never Dies for the character of Charles Robinson, played by Colin Salmon, that we pointed out. So Colin Salmon kind of takes over the M's aside role for the next 3 of those films. But everybody basically gets a part to play in this kind of final sequence. So we get M, we get Bill Tanner, we get Q. We're all playing parts. Moneypenny's here as well, so we're all involved. We're all playing pieces. M gets his big face-off with C. I think that's a cool moment where they kind of finally get to take their 2 kind of dueling ideologies and kind of physically put them head-to-head. And yeah, this whole sequence, it's very classic James Bond. And then it kind of culminates with Blofeld's defeat, where Bond makes the decision to not kill.
Before that culmination, I just got to point out my second Resident Evil reference. It's that Bond escapes this building just before it blows up in a narrow waterway that leads to the river on a boat with the woman he rescued, just like Leon Kennedy at the end of Resident Evil 4, rescuing Ashley from the building as it's blowing up on a jet ski out the narrow waterway. So there you go. Resident Evil reference number 2. But yes, this leads to this
Deep
final
cuts,
showdown.
Chris. Fantastic.
Thank you. His final showdown with Blofeld. He shoots down his helicopter, has him dead to rights. Blofeld now has his iconic scar going down one of his eyes, just like, yes, Dr. Evil. And I'm glad they didn't go all the way with it. Like he's in this helicopter crash, and I'm glad like it didn't like burn his hair off and he's bald now. They didn't go too far with it, but that scar looks pretty gnarly. But yeah, he's injured. He can't even stand up. Bond has him dead to rights, and this scene is really fantastic.
Yep.
It's been building up to it the whole movie. Like Ralph Fiennes has that wonderful speech about a license to kill. It's also a license not to kill. And that decision is at the core of being a double O agent. And then we have Madeline, who's questioning James Bond, why he wants to be an assassin. And whenever he gives that answer, that he never really had a choice, she disagrees with him. She says there's always a choice. So now here he is with a choice. He's facing down his nemesis, who has made his life hell. He has a license to kill. He has every right to assassinate him. But he chooses not only not to kill him, but chooses simply not to be an assassin any longer. Visually, standing on a bridge, on one side of the bridge is M, representing his life as a double O agent. On the other side of the bridge is Madeline, representing the life that he could choose to have, not as an assassin, but as someone with his own life and own agency and own happiness. And he makes the choice not to kill him, not to be an assassin, not to be a double O agent, but to go be with Madeline. And it is really wonderful. It's just the way it's foreshadowed, the way it's set up throughout the film. It's a great payoff. I have reservations about this potentially being the end of the Daniel Craig franchise, which we can talk about. But as we know at the time of this recording, it was not the end of the franchise. There's a whole nother movie after this. And I think it only benefits the film knowing that there's more to come. But this choice that he makes here is just really, really good stuff. The writing here, how we led to this moment, it's all working for me, and I really like what it's saying about the character of James Bond.
I agree.
All right,
but no, no, I completely agree. I think, like I said, I think having this be the finale of the whole thing was definitely something that people felt mixed about. Was the idea, because this movie does feel very final at times. It feels like the end of this movie, you're supposed to be watching Bond make all these heavy decisions with the idea that he is walking away. But I think with No Time to Die acting as this kind of epilogue, I mean, it's a fifth installment. It's not really an epilogue, but I think it only helps this film. I agree completely that you're able to bring the things that this movie brings to the table, and you're kind of able to explore them a little bit more, and you're able to make it all breathe a little bit more. Even Blofeld's brief scene in No Time to Die adds ripples and layers to the character that retroactively make him in this film more interesting. And again, just like, I think taking a lot of the pressure off of this film, this sounds kind of backhanded. I don't mean it to be, but when you remove the kind of onus of, is that Blofeld or not? When you kind of remove the onus that this is the finale, I think that takes a lot of the pressure off this film, and you're able to just kind of watch it as kind of it's the next installment of Bond. It's not the end. There's no mystery about who the villains are. You called the movie Spectre, guys. Hashtag PP. But I think it all helps the film retroactively to just feel a lot of the kind of the noise gets blown out of the way. The pressures are gone, and you're kind of just able to see it for what it is, and what it is pretty cool.
Before we wrap up, I gotta shout out my favorite line from Madeline, because we've talked about it. She's a strongly written character, has her own agency, and a lot of good strides in that regard. But she has this moment where she's opening up to James Bond about why she hates guns, because someone broke into their house when she was a child in an attempt to kill her father. And then, in almost the very next, shortly after that in the movie, she comes face to face with Blofeld, who says that he visited her father once at his home, revealing to us, the audience, that he was the assassin in her story. And what she says to his face is, I don't remember that. She doesn't give him this satisfaction that he left this lasting impression on her and scarred her for life. And she stands up to him like with no fear and just shuts him down. I don't even. It's like it's Bison saying, for me it was a Tuesday. It's her being like, that left no impression on me. Even though we know that's not the truth, I love her being able to make that stand in front of him. Very cool moment for the character. And again, we're looking at this movie retrospectively in the whole canon of the Daniel Craig era, and I already loved this series. It was already my favorite Bond series. Of course, the only one I watched, but I really liked it. But I have a lot more appreciation for it now that I've kind of dove into the history of James Bond and the different iterations he's had and different takes on the character. And I knew like this series made some strides to evolve the character, bring him to modern times and how it treats women, all those things, but it does it also like in a narrative way, which I'm fascinated by. Because in Casino Royale, like I said, he's already thinking about walking away from this life, and he meets what he thinks is the love of his life, and he does walk away and get away from it. But when he lets his guard down and he does that, he's betrayed by the woman, and then he has to watch her die.
Yep.
Because of that moment, he feels like that life isn't for him. He can't walk away from it. He can't trust people. He can't let anybody get close to him. That all feeds into why he is James Bond, why he's a man who will casually sleep with a woman but not get close, not let his guard down. You know, it builds into the story like why James Bond is the way he is, rather than just being like a womanizer who doesn't look at women the same way as he looks at men. There's like this built-in, again, narrative purpose that informs the character in his decisions, and it's just a smart way to do it. And it sets up this whole arc where, you know, we're the fourth movie in and he's finally come back around to maybe I can make the decision to have this for myself with Madeline. And I think Blofeld has a great line where she's the daughter of an assassin. She's the only woman that can understand him. You know, she knows both sides of the world, what it's like to be in the world of assassins and a regular civilian. She's like this gate that he can cross to get to this other side. And it's just a beautiful symmetry, beautiful arc. Continues in the fifth movie where he doesn't quite get that picturesque ride to the sunset with Madeline, but something very beautiful does come out of the relationship. And that is enough for him to be satisfied. And I guess I won't go into how they wrap it up, but I love the way they wrap up the James Bond story in No Time to Die. Love this franchise. My favorite James Bond, and I have a lot of appreciation for the past films. I'm glad I've watched them, but it's really only strengthened how much I love the Daniel Craig series. And I know I'm rambling a lot about how much I love this, but one last thing I want to point out is we've talked a lot about, as we talk about these past movies, how dense these movies are. Every single James Bond movie, you're introduced to basically a whole new world, a whole new set of characters and circumstances and villains. And in the past, because even if it's the same character returning as James Bond, the movies have been mostly standalone without carryover. It's a bit of a, I don't mean this as criticism, but it's a difficult franchise for me to binge because the movies are so dense. And then at the end of every movie, that's all washed away. The next movie, we're building up this whole new world. But with the Craig series, you build up that world in Casino Royale, and then you build on it and build on it and build on it. And you get introduced to new characters, but it's still within the same world. And I think that just rewards you as a viewer more than resetting with every entry. So I thought that was just the genius decision they made to make it all cohesive like they did.
I agree. I think it was, again, you're talking about the evolution in storytelling. You're talking about the things kind of having to move through. And it's, like I said, the James Bond of old had basically just become a gag. The idea of all of that. Thanks, Austin Powers. But at the same time, I don't think these movies are nearly as well remembered if they just keep following that old formula. I think the need to evolve of the franchise is what makes these films so interesting, and makes them stand out so much. And again, we're attracting like big names that were being courted to direct some of these Daniel Craig movies, especially by the end. Yeah, I do love Daniel Craig as James Bond. Again, don't make me pick. I can't, but these movies are fantastic. They're great. I love watching them. Casino Royale, I remember watching kind of on a whim. I don't think I saw Casino Royale in theaters, but then I watched it like I bought it or it was on TV or something, and I was just like sucked in. I was just like from the poker scenes to everything. I was just in. And Mads Mikkelsen playing Le Chiffre. It's some top class villains in these movies too. Mads Mikkelsen, Javier Bardem, Christoph Waltz, no exception. I mean, they went big for these villains. They swung for the fences, and most of them, pretty much all of them, crushed it. So, yeah, big fan.
Andrew, that's officially the last episode of 007 month. It is the end of November, end of this series. It has been a blast. It is time to move on to our next category, though. The month of December, we will be talking exclusively about Christmas films. Now, we're picking a list. We really opened up to all holiday films, but Christmas definitely dominates this category. We have our films selected we are going to be covering, and they do all involve specifically the holiday of Christmas. So we're kicking it off next week with Home Alone 2. First film we'll be covering for the Christmas category. Andrew, we've talked already on this podcast how much we both love Christmas. I love Christmas movies, good ones, bad ones. These are just words. They're Christmas movies. They're part of the spirit and the holiday. I love it all. I'm excited to jump in.
As am I. And there's a couple of new ones that I guess are percolating out there that I need to check out. I've heard good things about Ryan Reynolds and Will Ferrell's Spirited, which I believe is on Apple TV Plus. Which what even is Apple TV Plus? But
no one knows.
Definitely,
you just get a free trial for it, and you watch it for 6 months, and then it's gone forever.
It's gone forever. But also, there's a new one coming out in theaters December 1st, where David Harbour plays Santa Claus, who ends up in the middle of a kidnapping and has to become action hero Santa Claus. And so, opening night tickets for that one. Violent Night, yes. Yeah. Opening night, I'll be there. Stoked for that. I love me some David Harbour, who is in Quantum of Solace. So bringing that back around. But nice. But yeah, so I love Christmas. I'm excited to dive into it. Some interesting films we'll be talking about. I think there's definitely some movies that we'll be talking about where people may not realize they were not huge successes at the time. Christmas movies have a tendency to sneak up on their legacies. They kind of go unnoticed at the time or kind of go panned at the time and then kind of become these... I'm talking about Jingle All the Way, guys. But yeah, I'm excited to dive into it.
Yeah, me too. Love the season. But before we walk away completely from 007 month, we got to do question of the week. And this week, the question is from me. I have a question for you, Andrew, and for everybody listening. I want to hear your takes. My question is, now that the Daniel Craig era is officially over, we know he's not returning as James Bond. His story is done. I want to ask, not who you think the next James Bond would be, but more than that, where, in general, do you want to see the James Bond franchise go? For the first time with Daniel Craig, we had this concise, connected story, the James Bond story from beginning to end. Do they do that again? Do they go back to the old formula, something new? And of course, we do want to know casting. Who do you want to play James Bond? Does anybody come to mind? I've been thinking about this all month as we've been watching these James Bond movies. I do have a few ideas. I'm curious, have you thought about this much? What do you want to see from this franchise?
No, give me a heads up next time. Jeez, man. I think it's an interesting question because there's probably, I assume there's got to be some predominant mindsets that just keep with the same idea of these, epic scale action films follow in the method of something like Mission Impossible, of just kind of building these big, generally self-contained action films. But then again, I could see people kind of arguing that maybe now's the time for a Casino Royale-esque break. No returning cast, which would be a shame. I think there'd be some interesting people I'd like to see recur, but at the same time, I just in the nature of the way kind of franchises work now, I could see them trying to be like, let's just do a clean break. Similar to kind of, there's never really been a Bond series. Casino Royale is really as close as you get to a clean break because there's always some connective threads throughout every single thread. And even Casino Royale still has Judi Dench coming back as M, which I thought was an interesting choice, but I liked it. I love Judi Dench, so no problem there. But I think as far as what I'd like from it, Mission Impossible is just the easiest analog I can think of just these big, wild, globe-trotting adventures, which is what Craig was doing. I don't really need them to do another story about how Bond's old, so hopefully the Bond is young. I would go to the younger side, somebody that could be Bond for a little while and maybe doesn't grow to hate it. But yeah, it's I'm again, it's kind of going back to your earlier point. Like, I just want it to be interesting. Like, I really don't have any preconceived notions of what I want from it. Even especially who should play James Bond. Like, you hear all the names. You hear Idris Elba, who's almost 50 now. It's not going to happen, guys. It's Henry Cavill, even I've heard thrown out as a potential James Bond. Just all these names where it's these big names, but generally speaking, I think the biggest successes come from kind of picking the unknown, and I think they'll definitely end up going that route. But I don't know, Chris. What do you? Apparently, you've been ruminating on this for weeks now. So, what's your thoughts?
I have. Let me start with this. Even though, hashtag PP and all. Here's what I don't want. I don't want the obvious answer of what you do to the franchise today. I don't want the 007 universe, the Bond CU. No. I don't want, here's our 007 movie, here's our 006 movie, here's the crossover. Don't do that. Don't do that. That's not what I want. Here's my idea, Andrew. I was thinking about how someone like Christopher Nolan, he's made no secret that he is a huge James Bond fan, and he would love to direct a James Bond movie. However, I don't think that would ever happen because we've talked about it before. They have this revolving door of directors, and they do bring their own flair, but they also got to work within the story being told in that particular James Bond franchise. And Christopher Nolan, a Christopher Nolan movie is a Christopher Nolan movie. He's got his hallmarks. He's got too much of his auteur taste and flashes and flares, right, in his movies. It's like Quentin Tarantino. It'd be nice to have Quentin Tarantino jump in and direct a James Bond movie. It would so stick out of whatever franchise it's in.
Right.
So I was thinking, how could we get that to happen, though? Because I think a Christopher Nolan James Bond movie would be awesome. But I don't think he would agree to do a 4 or 5 movie series because it's going to lock up his career for 10 plus years. Yep. So here's what you do, Andrew. We just had Daniel Craig. We just had this James Bond story beginning to end, this big 5 movie epic. I think we move to one-offs. Not one-offs like we had where the Bond actor and supporting cast comes back and the story doesn't bleed over, but top to bottom, Christopher Nolan makes his James Bond movie. He casts whoever the hell he wants as Bond and M and everyone else, and he tells his James Bond story, and then he's done. And then you do that with a different director. Does Tarantino have a Bond script he wants to direct? Does Martin Scorsese want to direct a Bond movie? These creators that are out there that have interesting ideas but wouldn't fit into a long-running franchise for whatever reason, let them make their one movie with their one James Bond. And you could have an Idris Elba James Bond because he's not signing up for 5 to 10 movies. He's doing a one-off James Bond film. I think everyone wins. The only, not really a downside, but like if one of them pops off and makes $1 billion, the studio is going to want to turn it into a franchise, and they got to commit to just, it's one movie. Yep. Do what you want to do with it. And I would love to see what comes out of that.
I think that's a great approach. I would be into that. I think, like you said, it's kind of easy to just be like, just do the same thing again. But at the same time, like you said, I want it to be interesting. So I'm way into the idea of just giving these auteur level directors kind of carte blanche. Obviously, there's going to still be some approvals from the Eon Productions and all that. And that's expected. But, I would very much enjoy something like that.
Yeah, I'm throwing it to the universe. Let's see if we can make it manifest. I want to know your ideas, though. Do you have an idea for what the next James Bond should be?
Chris, I just told you I didn't.
I'm not talking to you, Andrew. I'm talking to them. I'm talking to you.
My mistake. My mistake.
I want to hear ideas. Hit us up on our Discord. There's a link in the show notes if you're not in that Discord server already. Hit us up on social media. Is Twitter still a thing? Is it still around by the time this comes out? If it is, you can hit us up there or any other social media platform. We're on all of them. I want to hear your thoughts about where they could go, who you want to see play the character, etc., etc. But it's going to be Tom Holland. It's inevitable.
He does everything.
I would like to see them return to the Daniel Craig formula in the sense that they tell a continuous story then after movie, but I think we need a buffer in between rebooting it again. So let's see what they come up with. But until then, until that next James Bond movie, just remember that maybe not every movie is great.
But all movies have greatness.
Thank you to Mark Benavides for singing our theme song. Follow him on Instagram at NotThatMarkAnthony. Thanks to Mitch for the music. Check him out on Twitter at I'm a Biggie Boy, and check our show notes for the SoundCloud link. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. It is the only way that we grow. And follow us on social media at BOTRcast. Thank you. Before we fully dive into it, I just want to throw a spoiler warning. Out there. I mean, of course, we're going to spoil Spectre. You should know that already. But inevitably, there's a good chance we're going to throw some spoilers out there for No Time to Die as well, just kind of as we talk about the entire Daniel Craig saga. So, if you have not seen that film and you're sensitive to those spoilers, just be aware. You know, if you didn't know that James Bond leaves MI6 to join Monarch, revealing that the 007 franchise is in the same universe as the Godzilla and Kong franchise, if you weren't aware of that, don't listen to this podcast yet. Go watch the movie first. You know, preserve those surprises.
Yeah, exactly.
Take a lot of editing to clean that joke up. I stumbled all over it.
You did. That's why I was like, I have nothing to add to this. French Dispatch also has a brief part in Inglourious Bastards, the Tarantino film of the same name. She's one of the La Petite family, in the infamous.
She has a brief part in Inglourious Bastards, the Tarantino film of the same name.
Yes.
What? Same name as what? As itself?
Yes, exactly.
I couldn't let that one go, Andrew. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I said something dumb, Chris.